Hey everyone, my name is Matt Laidlaw, and I am joined by my friend and colleague Thelma Ensink, who we're going to hear from in just a second. We were just working on preparing for the two restorative justice practice training events that we are hosting in October and November, and we had the idea to just jump on Zoom and hit record and tell you a little bit more about restorative practices. So thanks for tuning in for this little impromptu introduction to restorative practices. Um, I'll say that over the course of my career, I've served as a pastor, a school administrator, a spiritual director, a nonprofit leader, and I was first introduced to restorative practices 3 years ago at a training event I attended in New Mexico, where I was placed in a small conversation group of people from really around the world with multiple different professional, spiritual, and political backgrounds and perspectives. And entering this little conversation group, I was feeling a good amount of stress and anxiety about how the conversation was going to go. But those who were hosting the event, they gave each conversation group a very simple guide for how we were going to engage in the conversation together through a simple restorative circle practice, which I had never heard of before. And it ended up being one of the most transformative experiences of my life, as the really simple tool that they provided us actually allowed us to see and hear one another in a way that I had never experienced before in that sort of conversation. A few months later, I was looking for resources to help improve the school where I was working as a dean of students. I wanted to try and find resources to help improve the school culture and update discipline policies. And I was introduced to restorative justice practices, a community-based way of dealing with harm when it occurs in a community. And I immediately connected the dots to my experience in New Mexico, which both of these things sent me on this really intentional journey with my colleagues to try and figure out what implementing restorative practices in our school might look like. So over these past 3 years, I've read countless books, spent countless hours studying and learning from restorative teachers, restorative schools, restorative communities and organizations, and I've pursued resources through the International Institute for Restorative Practices, and am now actually a certified trainer for the International Institute for Restorative Practices. And on this journey, though it's significantly impacted my work, I can't think of an area of my life, any relationship in my life that hasn't concretely improved because of restorative practices.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Thelma Ensink, and I started my career as a paramedic in downtown Grand Rapids, and in that work just became keenly aware of the disparities and the tensions in our community. And while doing that, my husband and I were youth leaders in our church, and that drew me into becoming a high school teacher. And I was a social studies teacher in high school for many years, and then went on to become an administrator and had the opportunity to work with students with discipline issues and work through some of those difficult situations with them. And in doing so, my colleagues and I landed upon a book study on restorative practices. And I was really intrigued by how that could transform some of those discipline situations and conversations. And as we did this book study and we started implementing it, I was impressed by some of the impacts that it was making. But I felt like there was a lot of gaps in my practice, and I had a lot of questions, and I just didn't know sometimes exactly how to implement it. So Matt was the dean of students at our school at that time, and he introduced me to the International Institute for Restorative Practices. And so I started attending their trainings, and I found those trainings to be research-based, to be practical, to really fill in many of those gaps and really support me in my practice. And I found that to be so transformative and saw the impact that it had on my practice within the school as well, that I went on to become a certified trainer for the International Institute of Restorative Practices. And I really believe in RP as an educator and as an organizational leader. But what I have found through this, kind of like what Matt said, is I'm really also impacted by how it's transformed me as a person. Every time I practice, every time I train, I feel like I'm changing just as a wife, as a mother, as a community member, and that's been such a huge blessing throughout this whole process. And I think we need RP or restorative practices more than ever right now in our world. During this time of COVID, when we're physically distanced, we still need to be socially connected. So how are we building those relationships and building community? And also just with all of these tensions in our country and in our world around just racial injustice, diversity and equity, I feel like this is such an important tool for helping us to just have those conversations, but also to build community.
So let's not make any assumptions about what any of us might think restorative practices actually are. So the fundamental hypothesis of restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. I'll read that one more time. The fundamental hypothesis of restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. Restorative practices are an evidence-based approach to building community and resolving conflict that has been used for decades in the criminal justice system and more recently in school systems. But what's true about most evidence-based approaches is also true about restorative practices, because the practice came before the theory, as some version of restorative practices have been practiced in many indigenous cultures around the world for centuries. So our teachers from the International Institute for Restorative Practices, one of the things that they like to say is that we are all on a restorative journey. So whether we are new to this material or in some way we've been applying it for years, maybe even without this specific language, wherever we are in our story with all of this, we can always learn more.
Yeah, so the International Institute for Restorative Practices started out of Australia. And every time that you take a course through IRP, you are actually earning credit towards a graduate degree. So that's a really nice bonus through IRP as well. But at the center of this training that we do is something that psychologists will call the social discipline window. And we say that the social discipline window is really the cornerstone of everything that we do in restorative practices. When you come to the training, we will really go into this in depth, and you'll learn so much about just your own wiring, your own personality, your own practices as it relates to this. But I just want to give you just a hint, just a tease today of what it's all about. Really, the social discipline window says that within our schools, within our communities, with our clients, what we want to do is set really high expectations while providing a high level of support. And when we do that, that is when we are being restorative. When we do not have high expectations or provide a high level of support, we are really acting in ways that are punitive, permissive, or even neglectful. So as Matt said, when it comes to our students or when it comes to our clients, we want to do things with them rather than to them, for them, or not doing anything at all.
So when it comes to restorative practices and practicing what we call restorative circles, which we're going to talk about circles, and because we're doing this over Zoom and we're not actually in a room together, we're talking about a way of having conversations that are actually in the architecture of a circle. Chairs, imagine chairs arranged in a circle, with no table in between, nothing in between the people that you're encountering, and actually sitting in a circle together. And when it comes to restorative practices and practicing restorative circles, it's important that we understand what's called the restorative practices continuum. And that's really important to grasp, because often people will move towards restorative practices once harm has already been caused, or once a group of people, a community, students, or an organization is facing some sort of obstacle or has experienced some sort of harm. And now, okay, now we'll try restorative justice to see if we can help find our way through this. And the problem with that is that in order for restorative justice practices to actually work, you need to be spending 80% of your time and energy on proactive restorative practices, and then 20% of your time on responsive restorative practices. So Another way of saying that is, if we're going to try and live restoratively or help build a restorative culture, then we have to be spending 80% of our time on that. And then when we hit bumps in the road, when harm has been caused, that 20% of our energy is spent when those situations take place. If you're not working to build a restorative culture when things are going well, if you're not learning how to be together in a community when things are going well, then you're not going to be able to respond restoratively when you hit bumps in the road or when harm has occurred in relationships. So a little bit more about circles and some of these proactive practices. So circles can focus on setting norms, building community, playing games, or any sort of course content. Proactive circles can be used in classrooms, small groups, with teams of staff. They can be used as check-in or check-out circles, really brief times at the beginning of the day or an end of the day with a team or with a group of students to check in and check out. And they're also, circles can be all different sizes. So I've been in circles as large as like 60 people. Probably most often I'm in circles of groups of 6 to 8. And then also some really unique experiences I've had with circles have happened in triads, just a circle of 3 people. For me, what's really powerful about these sorts of circles is that it's one of the only spaces that I've experienced where what people share is not judged. It's not met with advice or redirected to be about somebody else. It's a way of receiving what is said just as it is and having the freedom to speak what you need to say, just as you might need to say it without fear of judgment or redirection. So again, when you think about these types of circles or practicing these sorts of conversations, you want to be spending, we want to learn how to spend 80% of our energy on those proactive circles, and then 20% of our energy on the responsive circles when harm may occur or when you may hit a bump in the road as an organization or with your students. So a couple of things maybe to note about these circles, which we'll get into in much more in depth in our actual training, is that circles have a bit of a sort of a framework, a guide for how they can happen. Sometimes they go, sequential around a circle. Whoever's sitting in the circle, you go one at a time. Sometimes they're non-sequential. People speak as they feel invited to speak or as they feel like they have something to contribute. But also participation in the circle is always voluntary. So if you were going to do this in a classroom, you might require somebody being present in the circle as part of your sort of the way you organize your classroom. But verbalizing or vocalizing something is always voluntary. So it's not forced participation in the circle. For some people, just being present to the circle can be a powerful experience in itself.
Yeah, and I was really amazed at, the impact that these circles made on students and just how students are building relationships and community. But perhaps what was even more profound for me was what it did for staff, right? Staff that maybe didn't know a lot about each other, maybe didn't have a lot of empathy for other staff members that were maybe pushing their buttons in the wrong way. But spending time in proactive circles really helped them to learn more about each other, to really build those deeper relationships and really build empathy for each other. I can think specifically back to this past March when we closed schools so abruptly during COVID, and the next day we met together as a staff for the last time physically together before we all went online. And we were able to get into these circles because this is something we've been practicing together. And you could just see as teachers came into the space how their body language relaxed, how they just felt that freedom and being able to share with each other without judgment of this is just how I'm feeling. Here are the fears that I have. Here's some of the things that I'm not sure I can do when we move online and do education this way. And it was really powerful to be able to spend that time together. And I think we were able to do that because we've been practicing this together as a staff. So it has a big impact on students, but also on staff. If you come to the training, what we will do is really give you practical examples. We'll show you videos, but we'll also give you instruction on how you can run all these various circles, again, with your students or staff, your organization, your clients, whatever your group might be. And here's just a few examples of those things that you will learn. A get to know you circle, right? How do you build those relationships and get to know each other? Check-in circles. How do we begin our sessions or our classes together with something that sets an intention for the day? Check-out circles. How are we feeling, or what have we learned at the end of the day? And then course content. We can actually really wrestle with content as well in these circles. And then there's some more complex circles that you'll learn to do, like feedback circles, where we can actually give each other feedback or receive feedback. We do that in a very safe way. And then fishbowl, where you can actually have some debate and discussion. But again, there's some very specific instructions around how we do that.
All right, so maybe a little bit more on responsive practices, responsive circles. So we mentioned 80% proactive, 20% responsive. When harm occurs and you go into that, okay, responsive 20% mode, those are often called responsive practices or restorative conferences. So restorative conferences, responsive circles, are specifically designed to repair harm when it has occurred. And there's a couple of different kinds of these restorative conferences. There's an informal way of doing it and a formal way of doing it. There's a way of learning how to have a casual conversation when maybe harm has occurred, but it feels like, oh, there's a way through this that will be teachable for everybody and will help restore community, but this wasn't like a significant blow to anybody or to the culture here. And then there's a more formal way of doing it when it's like, okay, this is going to take some very specific preparation, and we're going to have multiple people involved to repairing this harm because this was a really significant event that took place. So when it comes to those formal restorative conferences, there's usually a couple different kinds of conflict that may have taken place. One is what you might call mutual dispute or mutual harm conferences. So this is when, if you imagine you're a teacher, this is where there is just a cluster of kids who over the course of multiple years, they have all been harming each other in some way, and now it's all just coming to the surface. There's that situation. And then there's often another situation where there is a very clear offender and a very clear victim in a situation. And knowing the difference between those two forms of harm and the different ways to address that is something that we will go into more depth in the actual training. So it's really important to understand that when it comes to these responsive practices and restorative conferences, that this is not a replacement for discipline. One of the critiques of restorative justice practices is that it somehow softens accountability, and I would actually argue the opposite. It actually increases accountability because it brings community in relationship into the circumstances and the process. And then if you actually go down this road of trying to build a restorative culture and implement restorative justice practices, eventually it will transform your policies, your codes, your handbook, the way you train staff, and the way you communicate with the constituents who are a part of your community, school, or organization. So one story that comes to mind here, a really simple story, is when I worked at the school with Thelma, there was a cheating incident on in an exam at the end of the semester. And the instructor realized it pretty quickly while this instructor was grading papers, brought it to me, and we have very clear policies on academic dishonesty and cheating. So we took a look at those together, but we decided we wanted to try and address this in a restorative way. So I met with the student, I followed the scripts and the questions that are provided through the International Institute for Restorative Practices. I met with the instructor again, followed the scripts and the questions, and then we organized a meeting where the three of us actually sat down. And we were able to talk through very specific things about what happened, what was the student thinking about at the time, what has the student been thinking about since then, who has been impacted by their decision. And the instructor was able to hear from the student, like, what was going on in their life that led them to make this decision in this moment. And the student was able to hear from the instructor how this decision to cheat impacted them as an instructor. And everything from, now I have to come to these meetings with Mr. Laidlaw and talk through this, and now I'm gonna have to grade another exam, like, but also like the depth of like the relationship. This instructor had spent time with the student after class, trying to help them catch up and have what they needed for the exam. And there was a pain body there, some trust that had been broken. And when both of them were able to hear this from each other, there was still consequences, the code in our handbook that the student had to face for cheating. And the student followed those guidelines, but the relationship between this instructor and the student was transformed. And it transformed their relationship for the rest of their course experience together and throughout the rest of the student's time in our school. So in our training, we'll talk about these scripts and these guides for having these conversations. We'll talk about what are called affective statements. We'll talk about the importance of addressing shame. We'll talk about how to use restorative questions and scripts that in really simple ways can transform the entire culture of your organization, your school, and how we think about harm, discipline, and consequences.
Yeah, and as Matt said, we'll talk through all of those pieces and we'll share more stories as well. We both have so many stories of how this practice has been transformative in those discipline situations with students, with staff members, or just in our organization. I remember one incident when we had 20 cars hit in our parking lot during a basketball game with eggs. And as you can imagine, it just caused severe damage, thousands of dollars of damage to these vehicles. And it not only involved parents and students from our school, but also from the visiting school. And so there were just a lot of emotions, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of sorrow and despair. Like, who are these offenders? Did they hate me? Did they target me specifically? What's going on? And while I won't go into the specifics of what happened in this, I want to make a couple of points. And that's this, that restorative practices questions, first of all, just transformed how I worked with students. Because when I first became an administrator, I'd almost get into that interrogative mode, right? Of sitting with the kid and being like, I know you did this, because I didn't want them to deny responsibility. And switching to restorative practices questions and just simply saying to a kid who's the offender, what happened, completely changes everything. Because in this case, I found out that the kid that started flinging the eggs before things got out of control had been brutally bullied by another student. And while, like Matt said, again, it didn't in the end change the consequences, there were still consequences, we still had a lot of reparation and restoration to do, it definitely brought to light what was going on at the heart level. And it brought to light things that we needed to address with the student and also with the student that he had been bullied by. So that was an important piece of it. And also in the end, like Matt said, there were still consequences. In fact, restorative practices probably increased them because these students ended up doing a lot of service for the people that were involved. They ended up paying for some of the damages, either through work or actually through financial payments. But there also was just a sharing in the final restorative conference where the victims could actually vocalize, hey, back when I was a teenager, here's some things I got involved in, so I understand this, but here's also how it impacted me and how it caused damage not only to my property, but also to me emotionally. And it was just a really powerful conference, and I think the outcome was good for both the offenders and for the victims. With restorative practices, we see the offenders being moved from shame to responsibility, and we see the victims moving from despair to ownership. And that's, for me, probably the most powerful thing of restorative practices.
Hey, Thelma, this was fun.
Yeah.
If you're watching this, thanks for joining us. If you'd like to learn more, Thelma and I are hosting two-day restorative practice training events this fall in Holland, Michigan, through the International Institute for Restorative Practices. So the first one is October 22nd and 23rd. The second one is November 18 through 19. We'd love to have you join either of these events and help us spread the word. To register or to find out more information, check out the links that will be in the comments of this video, wherever it's posted, or you can reach out to us at either of the email addresses listed on this slide. So thanks for watching this. We'd love to see you in October or November, and we'd love it if you help us spread the word. So thank you so much.